there's so many smaller stories. My uncle tells the story about how when he went to the shop in apartheid with his father, who was white, he'd get fresh bread. And when he went with his dark-skinned mother, he would be given yesterday's bread. And I think there's something about people that exist at the edge of a society that was so racialized, that they're able to see all sides, and that they really experience almost both sides of the system. So, I mean, my grandfather was, in many ways, a beneficiary of apartheid. In many ways, he was had a very poor background, had minimal education. He was a hardworking man, really respectable man, but he just wasn't very educated. I think he had a grade 3, but he was given a job by the Natal Roads Department as a supervisor, basically because he was white. But at the same time, his kids could not go to university, could not study because they were mixed race. So I think that makes for sort of a very rich heritage. You know, my uncle tells a story about how he was kicked off the second-class train carriage because he's white and he looks like me, so he couldn't be on the second-class train carriage. But then when he got to the first class, where white people were supposed to sit, he was kicked off because he was coloured. So he kind of got left behind in Kimberley because he couldn't get on the train. And there's times when you sense the hurt and you sense the pain around dehumanizing people and putting barriers between people. So there's stories of fairer family members that reclassified. There's stories of divisions within the family. There's stories of, you know, the fairer you were, the more beautiful you were. Often a lot of this comes down to hair. I don't know why. You know, it's like hair is so important. And the pain, I think, is often in the small things. So I think when we think of our very painful history, we think of the big things. We think of Sharpeville, and we think of 1976, we think of Bantu education. But I think there's as much pain in the small things. Those experiences, like the stale bread. For people like myself, that I don't look coloured. I get told that a lot, and my first answer is always, what does a coloured really look like? I've seen colours that look like they're from Nigeria, and I've seen colours that look like they're from China, you know, and it's the same thing. But at the same time, I think there is no denying that there is a culture. It's not just a mixed bag of people that happen to be mixed race. It's a culture. It's an actual beautiful part of South Africa. And I think what does happen with it. It's very funny. I remember last year we did Mandela Day at a disadvantaged community, predominantly coloured community, and there was one kid that was blonde and had blue eyes, you know. And everyone, the foreigners, we have a lot of foreigners that work for us, were like, "What is that one? You know, is it a white kid?" And it was very funny. All the coloured people immediately in our group turned around to me and said, "No, it's like her." You know, every family has one, and it's true. Every family has one very fair member and one quite dark member, and I think there's all sorts of constructions around it. But I think what it does call into question is this notion of separateness, and I feel very strongly that it's a lie that we were told, that we are not, as South Africans, a separate people that fit into neat boxes. You know, that you are Indian, you are black, you are in black, you're either Zulu or Sotho, or you know, all the different sort of cultural groups. You Afrikaans, you Portuguese, you English, and then you get this other group of leftover items, you know, and then you coloured. I think the truth is that we're not that separate. I think the truth is that those boxes were created, you know, and it was a gigantic lie that we were told over 300 years, and that was re-engineered and reinforced. Most coloured families have a story of, you know, there was a black ancestor, or an Indian ancestor, and a white ancestor, and I think it isn't spoken about because in the past there was this lie that we were somehow, you know, we fell off the face of the earth and we were mixed race, and it was a neat box. and separate from the other neat boxes. And I think the reality of our society is just so different, that these barriers are not real. That doesn't mean that they don't have an effect on our society, but they were artificially created to serve a purpose, and they were artificially reinforced with, I think, brutality over generations in big ways and small ways. What I've experienced post 94 is a loss of identity, and that in the community. So people are looking for new ways to identify themselves. And there's a lot of this victimhood mentality, so previously we weren't white enough, now we aren't black enough. There's all those kind of statements that I think people are very familiar with. And I think what has happened is that many people have benefited from democracy in the community. I mean, I see it in my own family. There's stories that suddenly we have doctors and lawyers and business people. I won Businesswoman of the Year last year. There's no way a colored girl in the 80s, even if you happen to be fair skinned like me, would have gone on to do that. There's engineers, there's women that are studying. All of those things are changing. There's much more integration, much more access to travel, to the world. But at the same time, there are people who perceive themselves as losers of 1994, that of democracy. And that is also real. And that I think feel left behind. And because we're so racialized as a society, when I feel left behind, I attach that to my race. I attach that to my primary identity. And this is the thing that I'm passionate about. I think we need to move to a South Africa where the first part of your identity, the first building block, isn't your race or your ethnicity, but is the fact that you're South African first. And I know people, I think my story, because it's so unusual, has, in a sense, forced me to engage with identity and racial identity earlier than most people do. I always say, in a way, I was sort of raceless in this racialized society. And what I've realized is people are very uncomfortable with that. And a lot of South Africans will say to me, but what are you now? Are you white or are you colored? Or even worse, they'll make that decision for you. You are X, you are Y. You can't be colored because you're fair. You can't be white because, you have one drop of black blood or whatever. And it gets a little bit strange. And I had to kind of take a step beyond the hurt that causes and think about why. And I think the answer is so obvious. It's that your racial group for generations has been the one thing that determines who you are in a society. And I'm very passionate about changing that for the next generation. I don't want my daughters to have to ask themselves that question, but what am I? And then where does that answer come from? There is no more race classification board that, has some semi-scientific or bogus scientific way of measuring your hair and your nose. So are we going to do that to each other? I've got friends who are, one is, say, colored and the other one is white. What is their kid? How are we going to assign that identity to the child? And for me, it's a question that isn't abstract, because I think I've experienced it in myself, and I think it's the critical thing that we need to get to. That you are South African and a human being first. And that is the building block of your identity. And not the fact that you're part of some racial group that somebody decided that you belong to. So the question is around the boxes, the famous boxes on South African forms. It's, for me, 20 years into democracy, it's a really interesting question. Who decides which box you tick? So most of my generation don't even have a race on their birth certificate anymore, because we were maybe just born at the end of the Racial Classification Act or towards born after, born free. And yet we're still ticking those boxes. And I know the answer that comes through is we need it for statistical reasons, because we have a society with poverty and race are so clearly interlinked, and that is 100% true. At the same time, I think every time we tick the box, we reinforce barriers that were consciously created for us by a system that was designed to keep us apart. And based on what am I ticking which box? And how are we going to make people decide in the future which box to tick? Who decides? There's no more, race classification board, thank God, that comes along and says, you Indian, I'm white, this one is whatever, other, Asian, black. So do people just decide for themselves? Do you tick the box that your ancestors have ticked for 300 years? Do we really want our children and our children's children to have to tick a box? Is that the society we want? And I know we have to look at redressing racial imbalances, and we have to, for me, the number one step in curing racism is to ensure that race no longer determines your prospects. And I think to some extent it still does, to a great extent it still does. So I'm a huge supporter and a driver of employment equity and affirmative action, because I think that racism is so entrenched in some of our institutions, it will not change. It will not change unless there's legislation, unless there's a concerted societal effort to make people change. At the same time, though, I think there's a risk, and we're getting to the cusp of that conversation as young people in South Africa. Are we not racializing a non-racialized generation? So how do we address that very difficult inheritance that we've been left with around race and poverty and around discrimination without running the risk of dividing us again? And I think the boxes are divisional in a sense, that they put race back at the center of your identity. So I think it's a difficult question, but it's something that we have to, I think, solve soon, because there's a generation of young people coming out of university, coming into the workplace, going into school, that haven't experienced the kind of divided society that we grew up in and that we deconstructed. And the box almost reconstructed to an extent. And at the same time, it is also so true that race does still determine your prospects, unfortunately. And I wish it wasn't true. I really do wish it wasn't true. But the statistics just show that we are a society that is still so divided. Everything that we have achieved, unfortunately, there is not yet equality of birth in South Africa, in a sense that your prospects are the same based on your ethnic group, which you happen to be born in. And I think we need to come up with measures that go beyond that we look at poverty, that we look at prospects, and I think ethnicity should be one aspect of that, but not the only aspect. And I do think it sounds like an academic point, but I think it's a very, very practical point. Because every time we as citizens are taking those boxes, we dividing apart what belongs together. I would like people to tick one box, and that's South Africa in the long term.